And we're back for another episode of Standpoint. I'm Gabe Groisman. I'm so excited to have with us today the Lieutenant Governor of the state of Florida, my good friend Jeanette Núñez. Jeanette, welcome.
Thank you. Thank you for having me. It's great to be here.
I'm so happy to be here. I first have to call you out on air. We're from Miami, both of us. And in Miami, we're famous or infamous, depending on how you look at it, for being late to everything. You got here 30 minutes early. What's going on?
Well, I spent a lot of time in Tallahassee, and I think being late in Tallahassee is not really appropriate. So I think they beat it out of me, and I try to be early because early is on time is late.
I'm working on it. I'm glad I was able to get here right before you got here. But thank you so much, really, to making it out to the studio here in Wynwood. So excited. There's so many different things to talk to you about. I think we should start talking about Florida. I mean, everybody in the country talks about Florida. I travel all over the country speaking to different Republican governors and states, and Florida seems to be the envy of the nation. We see it in the numbers of people moving to Florida more than any other state in the country. Our governor DeSantis has obviously been very visible, had a great run for president. Unfortunately, didn't make it, but still continues to elevate the profile of Florida. You're there by his side. You're the number 2 of the state of Florida. You served in the legislature before. I don't think anyone knows the state of Florida, the insides of the state of Florida, more than you do, politically speaking. So what do you think really helps make Florida Florida and gives us the shine that we're having now?
Well, as a native Floridian, there's not too many of us, but it's the state that I call home, the state where I've raised my children in, and I'm really honored to be Lieutenant Governor of this great state. And what you've seen over the past 5 years since we've been in office is really a transformation of Florida politically, and we can get to that, but also just from the standpoint of everyone wanting to move here, everyone wanting to start a business here. I think COVID really accelerated some of that migration. We're number 1 in net migration. People from all over, in particular blue states, are moving to Florida. We've got number 1 in business formation, over 2.5 million businesses in the past couple of years, number 1 university system in the country. The list goes on and on. We can tout all the great statistics, but there's something intangible about Florida. The climate, not only the business climate, but the climate itself. Everybody wants to be in Florida. We're from South Florida. Of course, we see it in the traffic. We see it in the congestion, but really is a success story due to leadership, because, you know, what the governor was able to do during COVID, keeping our businesses open, making sure people could keep their jobs, making sure kids could go to school. As a mom, I can tell you, I heard time and again parents that were so frustrated in other states because their kids were locked out of schools. And so here in Florida, we were open. We were the free state of Florida. That's kind of been our tagline. And yet we continue to see that success way past COVID. We continue to see more and more people wanting to move here. And that's a testament to the leadership. That's a testament to the focus, making sure that in Florida, people know that they're going to be able to have their businesses run with very little government interference, get government out of the way, allow people to do what they do best, which is innovate, be entrepreneurs. And, you know, I really love serving alongside the governor because he is someone of principle, and you know him well, Gabe. He is someone that will not back down, and you could love him, you could hate him, but he is going to do what he thinks is right. And I really think that that's part of our success story too.
Yeah, he is who he is. And that's true. But the question really, when I think about Florida now, people talk about no income taxes, good weather. You know, we've always had that. Part of the equation also has to be how unsafe other major cities are around the country, and decisions made not just in COVID, but since COVID, on decisions to really pull back law enforcement and public safety. In Florida, we don't really see that, both at the local level and at the state level. And I can just highlight that, like, you know, after October 7th, the massacre in Israel by Hamas, anti-Semitism has been through the roof all over the country. In Florida, it's less than in other places, but it's still felt. And not only the local law enforcement has stepped up for the Jewish community, but the state law enforcement, FHP, FDLE, those guys really stepped up and made people feel safe, because we know security is one of those things. Public safety is one of those things where perception is reality. When if you don't feel safe, you're not safe. And people don't feel safe in other places. There's cities, you know, that where the numbers look good, but people don't feel safe. And whether that's fair or not, it's just a reality. And somehow in Florida, we do feel safe. And that's across the country. What do you think? How do you think the policy from a governor, lieutenant governor's perspective, how that trickles down to local law enforcement, to local municipalities, and how cities are actually run?
Yeah, and what you saw going on throughout the country was really disturbing. And what the governor did was very clearly and very quickly said that will not happen in Florida. He called out the National Guard. We weren't going to have rioting. We weren't going to have looting. And so he was very decisive in his actions. And he said, we will not allow local governments to defund the police, because it became a trendy thing to do and to talk about. Of course, they saw the consequences of that, and they're still living under the consequences of that. But here in Florida, we encourage municipalities to support police. I think many of them have. I know you were a mayor, and so you understand keeping your community safe. But what you wanted to have is someone at the top saying, we support our men and women in law enforcement. We will always stand behind them. What you see is more and more people are moving, not just regular average citizens coming to Florida, but a lot of law enforcement. We created an incentive program where people could come. If they're law enforcement, we recruited them from other states. We give them a $5,000 sign-on bonus to be able to come and do what they do, which is serve and protect and not be fearful of having to deal with the local governments that really don't support them and are looking to demonize them. So that's been really part of our strategy as well, to make sure Florida, we're at a record crime low, 50-year crime low. And that's something that we're really proud of, because I think that, like you said, if communities don't feel safe, then that has consequences that spiral beyond just, the numbers that you see, the statistics that we could talk about. So, from a family perspective, I think people are just really appreciative that we get behind our men and women in law enforcement. And we're not going to let our cities turn into, crime-ridden havens where you're seeing, cities, great cities that, I'm sure you and I have visited and enjoyed for many years, have turned into really just something that beyond what anyone could have imagined a few years ago.
Yeah, I was on the streets in Washington, D.C. last week, and a homeless guy kind of started saying some crazy things to me, wear a kippah. So he said something about being Jewish. I answered him, and it's incredible. I started thinking after, it's like, I don't know what the police would do if the police were there. Would they be defending me or him? Or how would that situation unfold if it would have unfolded a different way? Luckily, it didn't. But in Florida, we don't have that. But I do want to touch on something you said, which excites me, which is, Florida, a lot of our success that I see is because of COVID, and because of our response to COVID was so different than other states, and people saw it as a haven. Even people that were attacking us, we saw them vacationing here during COVID. They would, in one day, talk about how bad Florida is, and the next day they'd be here. I think AOC was on vacation.
Oh, they all were.
Like 2 days after she was on the floor.
Yeah, we had a T-shirt with the top 10 politicians that criticize Florida, and yet they're visiting and vacationing here.
I need a copy of that. But the question is then, how do we capitalize on it? So now that COVID's over, and some people have to be reminded of that, but now that COVID's over, how do we capitalize on that and keep it going? And programs like what you're talking about to bring law enforcement officers is incredible. Another program that I saw was just unveiled last week or the week before, which is the governor signed. There was an executive order, I believe, to be able to give in-state resident tuition for universities for anyone fleeing a university in another state where they're fleeing from an anti-Semitic environment, and they're trying to find a place to go. And Florida really is a safe haven for that, relatively speaking.
Yeah.
So that's another way to bring people over. What other things do you think we are doing or we should be doing in Florida to keep that tide coming? Yeah,
well, and just to talk about that a little bit, because the governor mentioned it in his State of the State address, for many students, for many Jewish students across the country, they were subjected to, forget harassment and bullying, full-on violence. And so for us, as an administration that has always prided ourselves on standing with our friends in Israel, and you and I know a lot about that, and we were in Israel together. But what I'll say is that the governor was very decisive and said, what we're going to do is, if students feel that they are being, bullied, if they're being oppressed, if they're subjected to violence in Florida, we will welcome them with open arms. Many of these Ivy League institutions have turned a blind eye. They're actually, in my opinion, they're complicit in some of this anti-Semitism. So, not only will we provide them with opportunities to avail themselves if they need assistance financially, but also we'll waive the requirements, because, as you know, there's an admissions process, and of course students have to meet deadlines and things of that nature, but we'll open up that process to allow them to come to Florida if they so choose. So that's just one way. Of course, the Jewish day schools, there has been no administration in the country that has been more attuned to the needs of Jewish students at these Jewish day schools, and so we have ramped up security. We have provided them with significant funding streams, and so that's on the education front. But what I'll say in terms of how do we keep up the a success story is the governor has been very, very forceful in working with the legislature to see how can we get more tax breaks for hardworking Floridians, because we know the disaster that's happening in D.C. We know the impacts that inflation has had. We know the challenges that people have when they go to the grocery store to pump gas. And so the governor has been mindful of that, and we've worked with the legislature. Where are the areas that we can provide some relief? We've provided tremendous tax relief, historic tax relief in the billions.
Are you saying that Bidenomics is not working?
It is definitely not working.
Okay.
Yeah,
Sure.
Absolutely not. So we've provided tax relief. We've provided toll relief. This year, the governor recommended waiving the fees, taxes, exemptions from waivers from fees on insurance premiums. We know that that's been a big source of difficulty for struggling Floridians. So we're doing everything we can to bring relief that's tangible to people, right? Because you could talk about tax relief and you can talk about things that bring some economic relief, but unless people are feeling it in their, in their pockets, I think that that's something that we've been very mindful of and are working with the legislature right now in the middle of the legislative session.
Yeah. So people don't really understand what the role of a lieutenant governor is sometimes. It's like essentially it's the vice president to our state. In Florida, it's different than other states. The charge is different. And I've been around politics for a long time, and I understand that really a lot of it's defined by the governor and what the governor allocates or designates to the lieutenant governor to do. And it's very interesting to watch you. First of all, because I like you as a person and we get along great and you do a great job in what you do. But also the governor obviously feels the same way, because the responsibilities that you have on your plate aren't even par for the course for a lieutenant governor in Florida. So why don't you tell us a little bit about what you're doing as lieutenant governor, what that role is, and let's dive into some of those things.
Sure. Well, somebody once said lieutenant governor is none of the glory, but none of the blame. And while, one could joke about it, what I'll say is that the governor really has been just so wonderful to work with. And he's viewed me as a partner throughout the entire time we've been in office, and given me opportunities to delve into areas, like you mentioned, that traditionally lieutenant governors don't really get to delve into. And in Florida, unlike other states, in Florida, it really is defined by the governor. So, I've had the opportunity to not only oversee the Department of Health since day one, working with the administration in that regard because of my healthcare background, but also have been very involved in the fight against human trafficking. And that's been something that I've been passionate about for over a decade. But in addition, I chair the institution that oversees all of our aerospace development, which is Space Florida. And that's just been a really great opportunity to get to understand the industry and how important it is for Florida, not only from a historical perspective. Obviously, we launched astronauts from Cape Canaveral, but also from an economic perspective. It really is, it's slated to be a multi-trillion-dollar industry in the next decade, and Florida is uniquely positioned to take advantage of that. But I also get to oversee the Advisory Council for Cyber, and that's something, again, really expanding the limits and the opportunities that I've had to get engaged. And most recently, I unveiled a new initiative called LG on Mission, and it's really focused on veterans and military affairs and how we can continue to do more in that space. Because I think, we talk about it a lot, and we are always willing as an administration to support and to bring policies to bear. But I think that, sometimes you have to take it to that next level. So I was happy to bring an added area of focus on that.
It's amazing. As you're talking, all I'm thinking is people don't realize how large and diverse in every way our state is, right? I mean, what's happening in the Panhandle and the industries that are there, what's happening on the Space Coast and the industries there and everything that's around that culturally. People think of Orlando and South Florida usually, and that's about it when they think about Florida, maybe the Keys, but it's all so different. And what you're doing is touching so many different things. But inside every man is a little boy. So you talk about Space Florida.
Yeah, sure.
And I know a little bit about what's going on in Space Florida, but why don't you tell us a little bit about what Space Florida is doing, what's exciting, what's happening in the space sector. Elon Musk and other folks have brought a lot more attention now to the space industry on the private side. But what's going on in Florida on the space industry?
So for a long time, Florida has been known as the launch capital of the world. And we know that the vast majority of launches happen in Florida, over at Cape Canaveral. Any given day, you could look up and see a launch. So last year, we had over 70 launches. 68% of the launches nationwide happen in Florida. But if
the rest happen in Texas?
There's, Texas, there's Vandenberg and then, other spaceports, but ideally, most people like to launch from Florida because of the location. But what I'll say is that when you see how that uptick is happening year over year, so this year we're slated to have over 111 launches. So the growth is pretty incredible. But in addition to launches, because that's cool and people get excited, like you said,
Yes.
little boys and little girls get excited about it. In addition to launches, what you have is other opportunities to bring in the entirety of the industry. And so a lot of MROs, which is maintenance, repairs, and overhauls, a lot of research is happening, and something which I think is cool and you'll probably appreciate, space tourism. It's a thing. It's a real thing. There's all sorts of infrastructure being built and being expanded upon today for that future opportunity to go into space and to be able to, as an average individual, just go and enjoy. And I, for one, do not want to go on a rocket. I know the governor probably volunteered me, but I told him, no way, I'm not going up in space just yet.
Was there a political message there? You want to put you on a rocket?
Hopefully not. But what I'll say is that the industry is much more than just launches. And so I mentioned it's slated to be a multi-trillion-dollar industry. Every company wants to be in Florida in some capacity. And so the Space Coast is bursting at the seams. You mentioned SpaceX with Elon and Blue Origin and all the big companies. Amazon's there. They're actively building out their facilities to launch satellite constellations into space. So the repercussions really are just tremendous from an economic perspective. And, Space Florida, they have the ability with creative financing mechanisms to go to the private market. They work with companies, large and small, a lot of startups. And we actually have a really cool partnership with Israel. It's been probably over a decade. We put together with Israel's Innovation Authority an opportunity. We call for projects. And so it's an Israeli company and a Florida-based company that they join together and they come up with some creative ideas. And so we put out those projects every year, and it's yielded quite a lot of innovation. As you know, Israel, and I think you've talked about this before, Israel really has so much innovation going on. For us, it's a really nice partnership, and it's the envy of other countries that are constantly knocking on our door, trying to see when they could replicate what we've done with Israel.
Yeah, they can replicate it when they put out that kind of technology, right? Florida will be there. The other thing that's interesting is, first of all, I speak to a lot of Israeli companies, and the excitement about being in Florida is tremendous. First, it's politically. They know the governor supports Israel. They know you support Israel. The administration, the community here is so welcoming. But the whole Space Florida experience is something that is known. I mean, you talk about it with people also in defense, downstream manufacturers of different things. They all want to be in Florida. They want to be around the Space Coast. They want to figure out how to leverage, whether it's through Bill Nelson with NASA or through you in Space Florida or with the CEO who runs it, how that works. And that really talks a lot to the economic diversity in Florida, because in South Florida, that's not something we see at all. It's really just something in Central Florida, more on the East Coast, right, around Cape Canaveral, et cetera. So that's exciting. On the cybersecurity front, that's something that affects all of us. Yesterday, my credit card was stolen. I had my phone call, I had to switch. This happens once a month. I know that's a very small part of cybersecurity. My brother-in-law runs a cybersecurity company, so I hear a lot about it. Tell us what you're doing to keep the state safe on cybersecurity.
Sure. And just before we close the loop on the space industry, what I'll say is that we're seeing a lot more interest, not only in the Space Coast, but really from Key West to Pensacola. So we've seen it branch out and touch rural counties in the Panhandle, touch areas that are outside of the Space Coast. So I say stay tuned on that, because the growth really is statewide, not just concentrated to the Space Coast, but a lot of exciting opportunity. Now on the cyber front, as you said, that's something that impacts us all, and the state is no different. We have a duty to protect our citizens, protect their data, and obviously manage from a state perspective. And, think about all the data that we hold and the responsibility that we have to protect that. And there's bad actors and, things that have been thwarted, that have been, made public. Back a few years ago before the Super Bowl, there was an incident that was avoided with a water treatment facility. And so really, if you think about the impacts to our critical infrastructure, water treatment facilities, hospitals, you name it, there's a lot of concern from the state perspective. And we have a huge state, 22 million people. And we also have quite a few local governments that, perhaps are not up to speed with their cyber practices. And
that's an understatement.
Right.
Perhaps.
That's an understatement. But we think about that too. Like what responsibility and how can the state partner? And so what we've done through the Cyber Advisory Council, which, as you know, has been it's been a great opportunity to bring a lot of talent from the private sector combined with public sector to look at the state of Florida, to make recommendations, to begin to bolster our resiliency. And what we've done has been nothing short of miraculous. Before, not a shocker, state government operated in a silo, and all of our state agencies were kind of their own little fiefdoms as it related to their cyber practices. And what we've been able to do is integrate that into an enterprise system. And so now we've got over 30 agencies that are coordinating with each other. They're sharing information in real time. They're linked up with our cybersecurity operations center. And so we're constantly working together to thwart bad actors, to, if there's an event or an incident, to learn from it, to make sure it doesn't impact other agencies. We also have worked with local governments. We did a grant program last year to allow them access to some of our leading edge capabilities and integrate them into our CSOC as well. And so it's really been, we've gone from 0 to 100 in a very short period of time. I will say that it's never a matter of if, but when. You constantly have to be ahead of the curve. You constantly have to be investing in this. But we've done a lot, as I mentioned. And in addition, we've also embedded cyber into our emergency operations system whenever there's a disaster. So think about Florida. We've had a few hurricanes in the past few years. The cyber component is embedded in that whole process because we recognize that the bad actors know when we're having a hurricane barreling down, that's an opportune time for them to try to penetrate some of our systems and whatnot. So we embed cyber into our operations centers, and really, we think about it more than just in the traditional way. We think about it from a whole of government approach.
Does it aggravate you how the media gets Florida so wrong? You can't turn on the TV or open a newspaper nationally or even locally sometimes and not read a negative story about Florida. And every time, if you dig like I do, because I don't take anything at face value, and you look up the statement that was actually made, you look up the bill that was actually proposed, you look up the actual situation that happened that underlies the article, 9.9 times out of 10, it's totally perverted and it's a different story that's out there than the reality. Does it aggravate you at all?
A little, but I guess I've just become accustomed to it. There's no journalism anymore. There is no fair and objective, unbiased reporting. It's all an agenda. It's all driven. They might as well just be a wholly owned subsidiary of the DNC because that's really what they do. They shill for the Democrats. They never want to get it right. They never want to share the actual story. They come up with their little, their slogans and their sound bites, and that's what they do. But like I said, I've kind of gotten used to it, and we do what we think is right. And ultimately, the people see through it. And it's sad because I think, trust in media is at an all-time low. So I don't think anybody really believes what they read in their local paper. And it is a travesty, but it is what it is.
So here's where I don't agree with you on it, which is I think saying it is what it is, which is how everyone deals with it, is problematic. I think we have to find the solution.
So are you going to buy a paper? Is that what I hear you say?
Maybe that's the solution, or start a podcast. There has to be a better way for Republicans to get the message out for the Governor DeSantis, for our state, and it's all over the country. Obviously, it's not just here, right? We're talking about Florida because you're the Lieutenant Governor here, but we have to find a way to break through that. We know social media has done that in a way. We get to control our own narrative, but I feel like we're still failing as a whole because the narrative is still always this negative narrative, and people can't find what's actually happening. Like we talk here in Florida, and you have people who are very active Democrats, and they'll still vote for Governor DeSantis or whoever his replacement is because they say, yeah, that's how I feel in general, but Florida's great. We don't want to touch it, right? But that doesn't even get out there. So, I feel like we have to keep at it because it's hard. This can't be how it's going to be forever, right? We have to figure out a way to get the messages out there because what is happening in Florida is spectacular, and it's an example for the whole country. And I think maybe that's something that was a hindrance to the governor's campaign, a little to president, because people have heard for so long, the wrong things about Florida. They don't really understand the real story of Florida unless they're from here. Everyone in Florida understands it perfectly. We feel it. We see it every day. But I think that's something we have to figure out how to work on. I'm not sure how to do it.
Well, I gave you a suggestion.
To buy a paper. That's good. I started with starting a podcast.
There you go.
So let's just go back a little bit. Last night I saw a little bit about your backstory. I was looking online about you. I saw this great video that was put out there about just how you were brought up. And I'd love for you to share your story, and I'll tell you why. It's not just to share your story. There's something that's missing in the American dialogue right now, which is the American dream. People say it's not attainable anymore and the economics don't work, but even as a feeling, even as a goal, it seems like it's not spoken about, right? And there aren't other dreams. There's an American dream. Like that's really what's the part of the fabric of our country. And from my perspective, as someone who lived in South Florida since I was 3 years old, there's no better story than the Cuban Americans, especially the Cubans who came in the 60s, early 60s, when Castro came to power. So I'd love to hear about your story and then how you feel that this country, what it lent to your family and what the opportunities it gave you, because you're sitting here today.
Yeah, indeed. So, like so many others, my parents came in 1961. My dad came first. My mom had to stay behind with my oldest sister, who was a baby at the time. And my mom had to pretend my dad had abandoned her. Just she didn't want to be persecuted. My dad was very much opposed to the Castro regime. So he comes, he sorts it out. He's able to bring my mom and sister, I think about 6 or 7 months after. Thankfully, they were able to bring them. And really just a typical story, struggled, did what they could. Their dining room table was an ironing board. My mom obviously didn't work at first. My dad worked as many jobs as he could just to kind of get ahead and provide. And then slowly but surely, they were able to move from that little efficiency to another one. And then ultimately in 1969, bought their first home, which, by the way, my mom still lives in today. And she's 88. So just a beautiful story about work ethic and resilience and really patriotism, because, my parents love this country. My dad in particular, he was always just such a patriot. And, my mom to this day, she says, this country gave us so much, and always taught my sisters and I to be very grateful, to make sure that we appreciated that American dream that so many are not able to attain. 90 miles from our shores, there are people that don't have the right to vote, that, could barely make ends meet, that are oppressed by their government, that are jailed, and, disappear for lack of a better word. And that story happens in so many countries. But, for me, having grown up in Miami and seen so many success stories like that, I think, when I was younger, I didn't really appreciate it. But now, of course, as you get older and you reflect and you see your own kids, I think it's something that you really appreciate and you recognize, like, were it not for my parents' sacrifice, I would not be sitting here today. We would probably not be talking. So for me, it always weighs very heavily in terms of appreciation, in terms of patriotism. And I hope I've done a good job of instilling that in my own kids. We always say, every generation, as the further you get away, they kind of lose that zeal and that zest. But, I have 3 children. They're, my daughter's 25, my son is almost 23, and my little one will be turning 18 soon as well. And so, you see them grow up and start their own lives. And then what I've seen is that slowly but surely, that drip of information that you give them, the work ethic, the faith, it really does come back, and you see it as they start to grow up. And my husband has a very similar story as well. His parents also came from Cuba. His dad is a mechanic. He's in his 80s and still goes to work. Even though he tried to retire, every once in a while he'll have to go back in, and just to see how he was working day in and day out. 6 days a week, he would be at the repair shop at 5 a.m. That's something that you have to value and you have to appreciate, because, today's generation, and I say this often, it's like the instant gratification generation. Everything's at the touch of a button. They get their food delivered right away. The access to information is unlimited. And so, I often tell my kids this, and sometimes I sound like a broken record, but, that American dream, what we've been able to see here in South Florida in particular, I think there's no better place in the country that embodies that American dream more than right here in South Florida, because of the stories of so many.
Yeah, my family's story isn't so dissimilar. There was a military regime for 13 years in Argentina, starting in 1970 or so. My parents both separately escaped. Literally, you could leave, but it wasn't easy to go. They both had some bad experiences and met here. No money. My dad was a doctor, had to start from zero. And that's the story of so many here in South Florida. But why, for me, it's so important to highlight it is today, everybody ascribes something to elected officials. So if they'll look at you and say, at this well put together lady. She's so educated. She's a lieutenant governor. What? She's a privileged person. She's part of the privileged class, right? But they don't understand your story because your story is so spectacular to me, right?
Oh, thank you.
Where you grew up, who your parents were. And when you talk about your kids, my kids aren't as old as yours. My oldest is 17 though, so we're almost there. And I think what you tell your kids is important, but what you do and what they see is even more important, and they see that. I also know for both of us, another similarity we have is faith is very important in our lives. So can you just talk a little bit about that, or you feel comfortable talking about your faith and sort of what that means to you, even first personally, not even in politics, but...
Sure. And yes, I think that faith really has just got me where I am today. Tremendous faith. I grew up, I went to a Christian school. And so that really, in addition to the faith that my family practiced and shared with me, that school really molded me partly into who I am today as well. And so when, my husband and I first got married, we were high school sweethearts, the whole story, we started having kids. And, I always wanted to embed in my kids the same faith. And so I think that, we see the consequences, across this country, some of the things that we see, in particular with the anti-Semitism or some of the other things that are taking place, just the desensitized nature towards violence. All of this is a product of lack of faith and, lack of family. And I think one and the other go hand in hand. And so we've made a conscious effort to be very purposeful and intentional with our faith. Just this past weekend, my son got married. It was a beautiful ceremony, and it was a God-honoring ceremony. So, I think that thank you. And I think you really have to, as parents, you can't do it alone. It's hard enough as it is. If you raise your kids without faith, I really do. It makes me sad, because were it not for my faith, were it not for, the amount of prayer that we do as parents, right? Because you never stop praying for your kids, no matter how old they are, no matter how well you think that they're on their way and successful in their own rights. That's something that is really just a lifelong journey. And, I really do feel so strongly about my faith. And part of when I mentioned we went to Israel, was being able to see, so many things that I had learned as a young child and as a young adult, and to see them come to life, and to pray at the wall, and to, visit so many important religious sites. It was something very special.
Yeah, that was a special trip. It seems like it was a lifetime ago because it was before this war. I know we were supposed to go back, and that got canceled because of the war, or postponed.
Yes.
So I look forward to that happening again. I could tell you that on the faith piece, you hit it right on the head, because it's faith and family that go together. And that's really, people are always looking for new role models for their kids, or what's wrong with our society, big picture. We're doing all these crazy things in our society as a society. And what's missing is nuclear family and faith. And somehow faith and family is being attacked, are both being attacked constantly. Yeah. And that's why it's important always to talk about it from my perspective. And I can tell you right now, in my bag, I have a book called Gates of Trust, Sha'ar Bitachon, which is explaining the difference between faith and trust, right? And how you have to have both. You can't just have faith, you have to have trust that God exists and that He's going to take care of things. And in difficult times, it's important to re-up on that knowledge, on those writings, on those learnings, because it's an important part. And also, as a parent, I always try to imbue to my kids that they're not just a snowflake, or a leaf from a tree that came out of nowhere. Like, they're part of a people with 4,000 years of history, and that's who they are. They're part of this incredible chain of history. And not only is it true, it's also understanding that and walking with that makes you walk differently, right? It makes you make different decisions. So we've been going a while, and I have to ask you, what's next for Jeanette Núñez? Okay, we still have 3 years. The Governor DeSantis will be there for another 3 years. But he can't run again. So what's next for you?
So, I really love being Lieutenant Governor. I've had just a tremendous opportunity. Some of the things that we've talked about, to be able to, make a difference and make an impact in the state of Florida. I haven't quite thought through the next steps, although I will tell you, I love public service. So I think I'll take a little bit of time and assess that and pray about it, because I think if you're somebody of faith, you should pray before every big decision. And I'll come back and we'll talk about next steps.
I hope we have next steps, whatever they are, and I know you'll make the right decision, but I'm not going to let you go yet. In this summer, we spent a day together at the Iowa State Fair. 2 kids from Miami, if we call ourselves kids, 2 people from Miami. It was a big group. and I have a lot of eating restrictions, so I couldn't eat much of the stuff, a few vegetarian things. But what was your favorite food at the Iowa State Fair?
Oh my goodness. Well, I did not have eating restrictions, especially on that day. It didn't do wonders for my diet, but I will say I can't believe I'm going to say this.
Just say
the strawberry shortcake, the deep fried strawberry shortcake. If you know, there was a little bit of a battle last year in the legislature as to what is the state dessert. You know, I am a big key lime pie fan. I think nothing embodies the state of Florida better than key lime pie. The state legislature, in their infinite wisdom, chose the strawberry shortcake as the state dessert. I don't think anyone thinks of Florida when you hear strawberry shortcake. But nonetheless, you know, was a big proponent of not, one-upping the key lime pie. And here I am in Iowa. So many great things. And the best thing was the strawberry shortcake. So
that was probably,
sorry, my friends in the Keys.
That was probably the strawberry farmers or something pushing that.
Yes, it was.
The lobbyist pushing that. But it should have been key lime pie for sure. We can work on that. My favorite by far was the milkshake. It was I had a stomachache for 4 days nonstop, but it was probably worth it. So anyways, thank you so much for being here. I love this conversation. I love exposing to our audience who you are, and really this kind of long form suits you so much better than a quick interview. And I'm so happy that you were here and you spent some time with me, and I look forward to doing some great things together.
Awesome. I appreciate the opportunity, and there were so many more stories that we could have shared, but I think we ended on a high note, and certainly appreciate you being so kind.
For sure. Well, thank you guys so much. Thanks for tuning in. We'll see you next week. Make sure to like and subscribe.